Chapter 7, Step Family. I was blindsided by finding out that my mother had met a stranger at the laundromat. He was an ex-boxer, an amateur, 5 feet 11 inches, brown skin, with a muscular build and close-cropped afro. His name was Fred Halliwell, and he was my future stepfather. He lived in an apartment on the corner of 41st and Kansas, down the street from the laundromat where he met my mother. Usually on Saturdays, I accompanied my mother to the laundromat, but this day I was at home cleaning the stove, piece by piece. I expected this tedious chore to take several hours, which it did. But had I been with her that day, chances are that Fred and my mother might not have met. To stop any potential male acquaintances, I would have foolishly brandished my knife in a display of protective love for my mother. The first time Fred showed up at our house, I recoiled into a defiant stance and refused to communicate. His cordial efforts to put me at ease fed my indifference. My mind raced with dreadful thoughts of being replaced by a dominant male. It was a devastating blow to my boyhood-seeking manhood, and my world came crumbling down. Fred was the first man ever to enter our home as my mother's love interest and my potential rival. As it stood, I was being dethroned by a stranger. I was furious. Is it possible that Cynthia cozied right up to him in a need for fatherly attention, or that she foresaw the benefits of a new stepfather? But Fred's arrival was too late for me. I had already established a warped sense of male selfhood. When he moved to a more distant house on 69th between Danker and Howdale, I thought it was the last I'd seen of him. Then one day Fred pulled up in his olive green 1962 Oldsmobile to take us to his home for a visit. Living there with his son, Wayne, and his 3 daughters, Vicky, Dimitri, and Bridget. It was an awkward moment, this meeting with no greetings or exchanges of names. In a strange stare-down competition, we looked at each other for long periods of time without blinking. The hatred circulating around the living room suffocated any possible truce. We had invaded their home, and my mother was trying to replace their absent mother. They saw us as the enemy, and I reflected their sentiments precisely. As expected, Cynthia clung to my mother for safety while I engaged in a stare-down to the death against 4 sets of indignant eyes. Almost from the start, there were toe-to-toe scrimmages between Fred's daughter Dimitri and me. Our hostility toward each other was adolescent foreplay. We actually liked one another, and Dimitri was cute, but we still kept our distance. Her older sister Vicky was built like Josephine Baker, the singer, and could have passed for being a grown woman. At 17, she could fight like a dude and knew exactly how to throw jabs, hooks, uppercuts, and combinations. None of her boyfriends dared to physically abuse her. They knew better. Vicky was cool, except she tried to talk back to my mother, who would have none of that. Vicky treated us fairly and never punched any of us. We stayed out of her space, and she did likewise. Our holidays and weekends were spent mostly at Fred's home because our divided families had merged. We were spending a lot of time there. Even the neighbors thought we lived at Fred's. The 3-bedroom house was pretty much open to us, but the socializing factor was missing. At every turn, we kids viciously degraded one another in an attempt to draw tears for blood. To them, our family was proper, meaning that because our speech patterns were devoid of ghetto vernacular, we were acting white. Being called proper was a euphemism for being an Uncle Tom, a white man's black man. To me, Fred's kids were country bumpkins, acting like ninjas. I had picked up the derogatory term from the streets, where calling a black man the N-word resulted in a fight or death. Throughout the house, we youngsters launched verbal cruelties back and forth. Their stinging effects were camouflaged by outbursts of loud arguments that often required parental intervention. Perhaps things would have been different if they had known that Cynthia and I had no choice in our diction. It was either speak with fluent clarity or suffer the consequences issued by my mother. We had to attend a speech etiquette class outside of school. Day and night, our mother stayed on us for using incorrect language. The regimental practice to speaking correctly was the only thing Cynthia and I shared equal footing for when punishments were meted out. Our mother's tenacity in shaping and molding our speech was working, but we were certainly teased and tormented for our precision. To stay out of each other's face, I spent more of the time in the backyard playing with their dog, Butch, a strapping jet black Labrador Retriever and German Shepherd mix. He was a loyal guard dog and a fighter. Back then, I felt more comfortable around dogs than humans. With no strings attached, a dog would accept me for who I was. On a few occasions, Little Wayne had caught me letting Butch out to chase the many cats next door. But despite our feuding families, the little guy never told on me, and for that I respected him. My taking the dog for long walks didn't seem to bother anyone, perhaps because I was the only one willing to clean up Butch's defecation in the backyard. Taking Butch for a stroll was an opportunity to scout the neighborhood. I discovered that any unleashed dog was a potential target for Butch's aggression. He was willing to fight any dog, anytime. Once I was walking him and stumbled into a dog fight in an alley across Florence Avenue. It took all my strength to hold Butch back as he snarled and barked at two monstrous pit bulls locked in battle. The ambience was of men cursing and flashing currency while the dogs were slinging blood and drool everywhere. The larger black pit, Crusher, won the fight hands down, but they had to use a wooden bar to pry his jaws loose from the other pit bull's throat. This gruesome sight was common among dogfights, but there was more to it than spilling of blood and gambling. A dog's chiseled muscles, its agility, and the enormous jaw strength used to combat its foes appeals to the testosterone of males of all ages. Being no exception, I viewed a dogfight with fascination, but was motivated mostly by the prospect of earning a couple of bucks. No doubt my mother would have been shocked to know that prior to the age of 12, I had been present at more than 50 bloody dog maulings. She would have hauled me back to a shrink pronto. I'll admit that Fred's neighborhood was buzzing with activity that I looked forward to experiencing with each visit, but my future stepfather had other plans for the new expanded family. He introduced us to foreign concept of a family outing. I wasn't alone in thinking that the idea of warring families going out to have fun was absurd. Our pouting faces should have been the reason enough to reconsider. Even Vicky was upset, preferring to stay at home with her boyfriend. During the ride, we pushed and shoved while complaining about the tight space. It was like being crammed into a foxhole with the enemy, unable to do anything else. My mother had to reach back and pop me a couple of times to get me to behave. Each Sunday, like clockwork, we packed ourselves into the car and headed for the museum, for Griffin Park or Knott's Berry Farm, or to one of several public beaches. To us, the family trip was akin to walking the gallows. After a while, I didn't care where we ended up as long as it was far from home. The farther we traveled, the more home became a blur, lost in forgetfulness. Almost instinctively, I tended to blend in with the surroundings and absorb the illusion of freedom and family damnation. As far as my eyes could see, I hoped that somewhere in the distance, there was a utopian place to go and never return home. Those family outings were the best form of rehabilitation for me. The therapeutic effect of escapism had made me a child of short-lived obedience. But back in the real world, the cycle of hostility between Dimitri and me continued. Our fights had to do more with unfamiliar circumstances than personal grievances. No punches were ever thrown. We mostly wrestled, pushed, and tried to toss one another across the room. This was our way of touching without seeming interested or enjoying it. For about a week, the house was blessed with peace and serenity. But the calm was shattered the day I returned from walking Butch to see a trail of blood leading up the sidewalk into the house. I found Cynthia stretched out on the couch with a blood-soaked towel on her forehead and a look of forlorn vulnerability on her face. But no one was willing to talk about what had happened, not even Cynthia. The incident was accepted by both parents to be an accident. I later learned that Bridget had somehow managed to hit Cynthia in the head with a piece of wood. Accident or not, had my sister chosen to seek an alliance with me despite our sibling rivalry, I would have honored it, but she kept her silence. Eventually, there was unspoken truce among us, but with lingering spite between our families. Cynthia still remained the enemy of Fred's kids, and I was pretty much despised by everybody until I stood up for Dimitri years later by fighting a guy named Ali, who tried to molest her. The fight won the respect of all my step-siblings. But up to that day, the arguments, accidents, and fighting like cats and dogs went on and on. There was nothing Brady about our bunch.